Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second Humanitarian Forum at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Kimberly Flowers. I'm a senior associate here for the Humanitarian Agenda and the Global Food Security Program. Formerly, I was the founding director of the Humanitarian Agenda program, and I launched this Humanitarian Forum 3 years ago. So for me, it's quite a gift to continue to engage with CSIS, and it's a real honor to be here. First, we'd like to thank the U.S. Agency for International Development and their Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. Without their partnership with CSIS, the Humanitarian Agenda program and this event would not be possible. I'd also like to acknowledge and applaud the CSIS Humanitarian Agenda team, the multiple CSIS programs who've collaborated and worked on panels for today, the streaming and broadcasting team, as well as in particular, I'd like to call out Jake Kurtzer, who's been aptly leading the Humanitarian Agenda program the last few years. He is missed here at CSIS and today. I'd also like to call out Jude Leonard for his efforts and their efforts on making today a success. Here at CSIS, we take security seriously, so I am the security officer for today. We don't anticipate there will be any issues, but if there are, for those here in person, there's an emergency exit just on the door where we came in, as well as to the right and behind the elevators here on the second floor. Our theme for our forum today is closing the gap. If you've worked in the humanitarian field for any time, you know what I'm talking about. This gap relates to the number of people in need that continues to be higher. Many would say highest ever before, or at least highest than we've seen in many decades. And then the funding that's needed for that continues to not keep pace. In fact, the overall official humanitarian assistance funding has plateaued. And the gap just keeps getting bigger. And then you look at the broader context, right? Humanitarian staff are overstretched and, quite frankly, exhausted. Local humanitarian staff often face threats to their life and face serious access constraints. There are more than 50 civil wars and conflicts happening in the world today. The climate change-related emergencies happening more often, happening with more severity. COVID-19 pandemic is still taking an extreme toll. Am I making you feel sad yet? This is really grim, right? And it just keeps going. You have extreme poverty that's rising, so are food and energy prices. Forced displacement is at an all-time high. And there's the potential for famine in the Horn of Africa. It's a very, very grim picture. And then you have the US media, and I would also say many US policymakers, that are focused singularly just on Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the most important humanitarian crisis today. Certainly deserves attention, but limited aid is being diverted to the crisis there while other humanitarian crises are being left behind. You will see in the program for today and for the conference today, that's why some of our country-led panel discussions are focusing on issues in Afghanistan, Syria, Haiti, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So given this context, is the global humanitarian system currently in place able to keep up with what's going on in terms of demand? How can we reshape the system to do more with less, to truly engage non-traditional partners, and to modernize and adapt to a world where, unfortunately, humanitarian crises seem to be growing in number and severity? Well, we have two humanitarian experts and leaders with us this morning that's going to help us think through this and better understand these global challenges that we're facing. We have Juliet Parker, the head of ALNAP, and we have Sarah Charles, who leads the USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. If you are listening online, I encourage, as you listen to the remarks, to submit questions through the button on the event page. If you are here in person, you can also submit questions using the QR code that's on your table. So now it's my honor to introduce Juliet Parker. Juliet is the director of ALNAP. ALNAP, we love acronyms in this sector, don't we? ALNAP stands for the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action, which does exactly that. It's an organization that conducts independent assessments of the humanitarian sector using knowledge, data, and evidence so that the humanitarian sector can improve its response to these crises that we've talked about. Juliet is joining us from London. She has over 2 decades of experience in the humanitarian sector, including working at, most recently before ALNAP, the Action Against Hunger in UK, as well as many years with Christian Aid. She's an expert in monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, and she has a passion, and now she's in a position where she can use that as well as evidence to help us understand and improve what is working and what is not in the humanitarian sector. Please give a warm welcome to Juliet Parker.
Great, thank you. I am delighted and honoured to be here with you all today. The ALNAP State of the Humanitarian System report provides the longest-running evidence base on the performance of international humanitarian action, reaching back nearly 15 years over 4 previous editions. This year's edition covers humanitarian response from the years 2018 to 2021 inclusive. Each of our reports is compiled through at least 10 main inputs, including original in-country research, surveys, financial and demographic analysis, and a synthesis of publicly available evaluations. Drawing on these inputs, we not only assess performance, but are also able to draw comparisons to previous editions in order to provide the long view on how the humanitarian system is changing over time. One of the defining features of this year's edition is that the humanitarian system is facing challenges unlike those it has seen before. The questions I'd like to briefly explore with you this morning are, how has the humanitarian system performed over the past 4 years of extreme crisis? And how well does this set it up for a difficult and uncertain future? I'll answer these questions by highlighting key findings from our report across 3 main areas. First, the demand for humanitarian assistance and protection over the past 4 years. Second, how the size and shape of the humanitarian system has changed. And finally, some key findings on how humanitarian assistance has performed. Starting with the global context. Over the past 4 years, we have seen regime changes in Afghanistan and Myanmar, and the most significant disaster in Haiti since the 2010 earthquake. Conflicts grew longer and more numerous, and there was a rise in climate-related disasters, and all of this before we even get to the unprecedented crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. The impacts of conflict and disasters have been clear, as the number of people living in forced displacement doubled over the past decade. And just in the past 5 years, the number of people facing acute food insecurity rose by 33%, and this is before the war in Ukraine drove up food prices astronomically this year. Looking at the pandemic, while the direct impacts of COVID-19 were not as severe as first feared, the indirect impacts through widespread economic shutdown and lockdown restrictions were profound. Protection risks soared, millions of children lost access to education, and nearly 100 million people worldwide were estimated to be pushed below the poverty line, making them less able to withstand other shocks. As a result of all these dynamics, we saw the number of people estimated to be in need of humanitarian assistance and protection in the UN appeal system nearly double over a 5-year period, reaching 255 million in 2021 after peaking at 439 million in 2020 due to the pandemic. At the same time that the demand for humanitarian assistance increased, the ability of humanitarians to stand in solidarity with people affected by crisis became even more difficult. Conflict is not only on the rise, but we found consistently the nature of conflict is changing and making humanitarian access more difficult. This is illustrated by the rise of attacks on aid workers, which rose by 67% between 2017 and 2021, with national staff comprising 95% of the victims of these attacks. And of course, access challenges go beyond direct violence and include increased bureaucracy, political interference, and counterterrorism rules and sanctions. Our last report, in 2018, noted a sharp decline in respect for international humanitarian law, and the situation has only worsened in recent years. As one humanitarian worker we spoke to said, the system is in a fight for core norms. And these challenges with humanitarian space have real impacts on the ability of agencies to deliver aid, as we saw in our survey of aid recipients in Ethiopia. Here, when we asked our questions about the quantity and quality of aid received, the responses in Tigray behind the government blockade were considerably lower than in other parts of the country. And in fact, these responses were some of the lowest satisfaction scores we've seen since our first survey in 2011. So as the job became more difficult, how has the system's size and capacity changed to meet this? Just to pause briefly here on definitions, our research focuses on the international humanitarian system, which we primarily consider to be organizations that receive international private or public funding for humanitarian response. This includes NGOs, both national and international, UN agencies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and the branches of governments involved in humanitarian donorship or response. By any measure, in terms of money, people, and footprint, this system has expanded significantly in recent years. This is seen in the doubling of in-country humanitarian personnel, and the estimated number of humanitarian organizations has increased from roughly 4,500 to over 5,000, primarily due to the increase of local and national organizations. Funding for humanitarian action has also doubled over the decade, reaching $31.3 billion in 2021, but as many of us are aware, funding has leveled off in recent years. And as a result, the gap between what is required to support people in crisis and what is available has widened. The green blocks on the chart here behind me indicate levels of resource, and the black dots above them indicate required funds. And as you can see, the line between them gets ever longer as we move from 2012 to today, with 2020 being the year in which this gap reached an all-time high, with appeals only 51% funded. When we look beyond the global figures at a more granular level, we can see two important trends. The first is that there is significant variation in funding levels for different crises. 40% of all humanitarian assistance went to just 5 countries. And while these certainly featured some of the highest caseloads, other crises also featured severe need, yet received far less than what was required. And in fact, the gaps between the best-funded UN appeal and the worst-funded appeal is widening. A few years ago, there was around a 70% gap between the best and worst funded, and this widened to a 181 percentage point gap in 2020. A second reflection from the data is that the system continues to be highly concentrated in terms of who gives and who directly receives humanitarian funding. When we look at who receives humanitarian funding over 2018 to 2021, 40% of all funding went directly to 3 UN agencies, with the World Food Programme receiving more than a quarter of all humanitarian funding directly. This poses some questions for the ability of the humanitarian system to change, when we consider that local and national actors actually saw their share of direct funding decline over the study period. The call to localize humanitarian action became ever stronger in the past 4 years, linked to calls to decolonize aid, and the COVID-19 pandemic provided new opportunities for local leadership, but despite these drivers for change, we saw no significant progress, with national NGOs saying that partnerships remained akin to subcontracting relationships in which they had little say or power. 6 years on from the World Humanitarian Summit, our localization research with the NEAR network found that debates over how localized the system should become and how best to get there are still ongoing. Turning to who gives assistance, we again see a coordinated theme of concentration amongst the top 5 donors, who provided over 50% of all humanitarian assistance last year, with the United States now contributing over 30% of all humanitarian aid globally. This high concentration in who gives and who receives humanitarian aid has one major implication, which is that changes in approach made by these top 5 donors or changes made by the UN system can lead to significant change and performance in the system, whether that's for better or for worse. And that brings me on to how the system actually performed over the past 4 years. Really looking at 2 questions. Does humanitarian action work? And how does it treat the people it aims to serve? Here our focus was really on evidence of outcomes rather than outputs in the report. So what did the system achieve rather than what did it simply deliver? And while the evidence base still needs improving, and there are still data gaps around issues like mortality rates in crises, overall, I think it is important to stress that the available evidence tells us that humanitarian aid does work and is consistently achieving a range of positive, short-term outcomes for people affected by crisis. We found many examples covering education, water and sanitation, better food security and nutrition, and improved livelihoods. Of course, one of the clearest areas where we see consistent evidence of outcomes is in cash assistance. And you can see on the slide here just a few examples of the outcomes cash assistance achieved over 2018 to 2021 in multiple contexts. One that stuck out to us is lower morbidity rates for children under the age of 5. And therefore, the fact that the system expanded its use of cash and voucher assistance from 14% to 20% of all humanitarian aid in 2020 can be taken as an illustration of its improved effectiveness. We also saw positive developments in the timeliness of humanitarian response. This was largely driven by investments in preparedness, forecast-based financing, and anticipatory action. There was also emerging evidence that anticipatory action is more effective. In Bangladesh, providing aid before the monsoon hit led to measurably improved outcomes for households. But at the moment, these efforts around anticipation and crisis prevention have been largely pockets of experimentation and are not scaling out to really change the model of how humanitarian aid is delivered, as we are now unfortunately seeing in the delayed response to the Horn of Africa drought. While short-term aid continues to be effective and appreciated, crises are getting longer and more frequent. And this means more people are experiencing humanitarian aid more repeatedly or for longer periods of time. And yet we saw that humanitarian agencies are not adapting what they offer to address changes in need over time, nor are they working to provide or address longer-term priorities of affected people to support their resilience. As a result of this, the number of affected people who felt aid was relevant declined slightly since 2018 from 39% to 34%. We heard from aid recipients in Yemen and DRC that while food aid and other short-term forms of assistance were useful for them, there were many other issues such as broader healthcare, access to education and livelihood support, where they were receiving little to no support. This points to the need to join up the dots between humanitarian assistance and longer-term development and peace aid. While we saw strong policy shifts, restructuring of donor agencies and new initiatives around the so-called HDP nexus, at country level, the impact was not evident. There were frustrations that the discussion on closing the gaps between short-term and long-term assistance were too abstract and confusing, that programmatic progress was piecemeal, and that there was no collective accountability to implement collective outcomes. Turning now to how the system treats people affected by crisis. On the positive side, when we looked at the dignity of people in crisis, a majority, 73%, said they felt treated with dignity. In addition, we also saw tangible improvements in the resources and systems used to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, as well as a strong policy response to these issues, led by the US and other donors. Also positively, we saw that the participation of affected people continues to be linked to better performance. The aid recipients in our survey who said they were consulted prior to receiving aid were 2.2 times more likely to say that aid was relevant, 2.7 times more likely to say that the aid they received was of good quality, and 2.5 times more likely to say that they received enough aid. This is one reason why it is perhaps disappointing that we found that overall the level of engagement and participation of crisis-affected people in humanitarian decision-making has not improved over the last 4 years. Only 1 in 3 people in our survey said they had the opportunity to provide their opinion on aid they received. This was slightly surprising as many agencies have made significant effort to implement feedback mechanisms and improve engagement over the past 4 years. But we think a likely explanation for this is the COVID-19 pandemic, which forced many agencies to switch to remote methods of communication, which are less preferred and accessible by many aid recipients. So, what does all of this mean for the future of humanitarian action and the priorities of the largest donor to humanitarian aid? We've seen that the humanitarian system is larger, but has not grown in proportion to the size of the problem it's trying to tackle, which has grown both due to increase in caseload and increase in ambition. It is effective, but narrowly so. The agency of people in crisis is increasingly taken into account, but the system is still far from putting people fully at the centre. And the system is evolving, making observable improvements, but these are not as significant or as fast as desired, or some might argue as is required. And as the system debates its future identity, it is entering an era in which it is consistently under direct threat and cannot take multilateralism or global affirmation of humanitarian norms as a given. Looking at the challenging years ahead, all of this means the humanitarian system will need to grapple with what solidarity with people in crisis looks like, in terms of its scale of ambition, in terms of its presence, in terms of what it offers, how it engages, and who leads it. And it will need to do this internal work while simultaneously defending the core humanitarian idea that all of us have a moral responsibility to stand with all people affected by crisis. The international system is going to need to be more assertive about humanitarian space, more ambitious about what people deserve, and yet more humble about knowing its place alongside others to deliver it. Let us hope it succeeds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. You know, one of the things that's sticking out to me, there's a lot of numbers in all of this, and if you look at the full report of the state of the sector from ALNAP, it's over 300 pages. There's a smaller executive summary too, so don't worry. But it's rich, it's full of a lot of details. But some of the highlights that's staying with me from Juliet's presentation is looking at the numbers in terms of funding, right? So over 31 billion in funding. And of that 31% is from the United States. It's a lot of dollars. That's a lot of taxpayers' dollars. And the person that is responsible for helping implement a lot of those dollars is Sarah Charles, who we have with us today. And let me tell you a little bit about Sarah before she comes up. Sarah, under the Biden administration, is the assistant to the administrator for USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Most of you are probably familiar with BHA, which it's also called, but it's the U.S. government lead in terms of international disaster response. So it has a mandate to save lives, alleviate human suffering, and reduce the impact of disasters. So a huge task given today's context. Prior to going to USAID, Ms. Charles was the Senior Director for Policy and Advocacy with the International Rescue Committee. She also worked for a number of years at the White House with the National Security Council, directing humanitarian affairs and also working on strategic planning. Her experience has a wide range with a lot of different countries and crises, including a lot of work with refugee work, as well as working on the response to the Ebola crisis, and working on the global refugee and migration crisis in general. She also, previously to the NSC, worked at USAID working on the Middle East and USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. She helped lead USAID's response to the post-Arab Spring efforts. When she was at International Rescue Committee, she also worked on the emergency response in Darfur. So she has a wealth of experience, decades of experience in the field, working both with NGOs as well as the government, and she's here today to give us her thoughts, both to the report and what's happening in the sector today. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, CSIS, for having me here today. And thank you, Juliet, for sharing the findings of ALNAP's important work. Your report demonstrates the incredible impact of the global humanitarian assistance, but I think is a really meaty and important deep dive into the real challenges that we're facing as we head into 2023. I'd like to share some thoughts on the themes of the report, but also really looking forward to diving in more detail during the question and answer session. First, I want to talk about the humanitarian financing gap. Over the last 5 years, the number of people in need has nearly doubled from 141 million to 274 million. And the amount of funding required to meet those needs has been on the same trajectory, increasing from 23.9 billion in 2017 to 41 billion in 2022. As this group knows well, this is the confluence of COVID, climate change, new and ongoing conflicts. It's also due to the humanitarian system being stretched to not only meet life-saving needs, but basic needs and social support in crises that have been going on for 5, 10, 20, in some cases 40 years. However, we haven't seen a commensurate increase in humanitarian funding. The 2022 Global Appeal, as we heard, was nearly 60% underfunded, and the donor base remains slim. In recent years, as we heard from Juliet, 3 largest donors have accounted for roughly 60% of all humanitarian funding. And as Kim noted, in this report, it talks about the US being responsible for approximately 30%. I think when we do add up the receipts for 2022, we're going to see that percentage skyrocket to closer to 40, 45% this year. This model is unsustainable. It's critical that we engage new actors to help us save lives, alleviate suffering, and as importantly, support communities' resilience. BHA is working diligently on this front. We're working to bring more attention and collective donor action to keep multilateral development banks active in fragile settings. In particular, we're encouraging the banks to work closely with the humanitarian assistance system to address social protection and basic service needs driven by protracted crises. We're also trying to crowd in private financing. USAID, in partnership with IOM, is piloting a platform for increasing coordination between the humanitarian system and diaspora groups that are best placed often to get resources quickly to communities in need. We're also working with philanthropic donors. For instance, USAID recently mobilized $280 million from private donors to meet the needs of children facing the deadliest form of acute malnutrition. But the solution to closing the resource gap is not just about new donors. It's also about how effectively we're using the dollars that we have. At USAID, one way we're improving our effectiveness is by strengthening our partnership with local actors, from affected communities and local civil society to national disaster management agencies and the local private sector. Our forthcoming policy on localization and humanitarian assistance, which hopefully many of you have seen, it's out for public comment right now, will lay out how we plan to achieve this in crisis context in the coming years. The second issue I want to raise is climate change. In travel this summer in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Pakistan, it was incredibly evident that climate impacts are now, not some future threat. Climate change, as many in this room know, is driving new needs while exacerbating existing ones. As we've seen in Pakistan, in the Horn, climate shocks like flooding and droughts cause death, disease, destruction, and displacement. And the people most vulnerable to climate change are often those experiencing crisis and conflict. They're also the ones that have the least access to the financing needed to prepare for and be resilient to climate change. Right now, world leaders are in Egypt to discuss how to prepare for, mitigate, and adapt to the impacts of climate change. When I travel there next week, I plan to highlight 3 issues that the international community should be focused on. The first is advancing early warning and early action, which we know saves lives. Early warning ahead of Typhoon Rai in the Philippines last year meant there were a few hundred deaths, each one of them tragedies, but a vast improvement over the tens of thousands of deaths we saw from similar storms just a decade ago. Yet 1/3 of the world's population doesn't have access to early warning. To close this gap, USAID is partnering with the World Meteorological Organization and NOAA to expand national early warning systems. We're also investing in flexible, rapid response funds to enable early action and in community-driven responses to make sure those increases in early warnings are actually reaching communities in need. Second is supporting local communities who are on the front lines of climate crises. The people most impacted by climate shocks must have a central role in climate planning and decision-making. Stay tuned for more of our efforts in this space, again, to make sure resources are getting to those local communities. And third, we need to close the climate adaptation financing gap for conflict-affected communities. Far too much of adaptation financing is through government-to-government channels. We need to explore new ways for international financial institutions, the private sector, and other donors to ensure that climate financing gets to those who need it most, including those that are living under regimes that are belligerent, or those who are living in relatively ungoverned spaces. The last topic I want to raise is humanitarian access. Humanitarian access is widely seen to be shrinking. We heard this from Juliet. While insecurity in many humanitarian contexts is growing. Indeed, attacks on humanitarian workers continue to rise. ALNAP's report rightly notes that humanitarians are also concerned about the impact of government-imposed restrictions like sanctions and counterterrorism measures. Some 42% of respondents in 2021 said that measures prevented staff from carrying out certain activities or impeded access to areas with acute needs. This is a key priority area for the US government, for USAID, and for BHA. I'm pleased with the outcome of our efforts over the past year, including our help in securing US legal authorizations and adoption of a UN Security Council resolution to ensure assistance continues to reach at-risk populations in Afghanistan, even while the Taliban continues to be sanctioned. We also helped push for OFAC's simultaneous communication about humanitarian exemptions and licenses alongside sanctions against Russia. This improvement has minimized ambiguity for our partners in Ukraine, their banks, and other donors and regulators. Going one step further, and as Secretary Blinken announced at the UN General Assembly just last month, the US government, maybe 6 weeks ago, the US government is working with other Security Council members to create a standardized humanitarian carve-out for actors that deliver humanitarian assistance and other activities that support basic human needs. We're also coordinating inside the US government to ensure that such humanitarian authorizations would be included across US domestic sanctions programs. Finally, USAID also supported the CSAS, US Multi-Stakeholder Working Group on Financial Access, which released its report and recommendations just a couple of weeks ago. This was an important project that brought together USAID, Treasury, the State Department, US regulators, NGOs, and financial institutions to identify ways to mitigate de-risking as a result of sanctions. Still more is needed in this area, and you can count on me to continue and count on BHA, USAID, and the US government to continue working on these issues. There were many important themes in ALNAP's report, which I haven't had a chance to touch on yet, but I look forward to discussing with you, Kim, and with the audience here.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Juliet, for being here, for your leadership, for your remarks. Let's start with the report. So first I want to ask Juliet, you've been in this field for a long time, but this is a somewhat new position for you, right? You've been there a few years, but now that you're in this think space, in this sort of analytical space, there was no way for you to cover all of the highlights. There's so much in it, but was there one thing that really surprised you or that sort of shocked you about the report that's sort of staying with you?
Yes, one thing is difficult.
I know.
It's a 350-page report. And,
yeah.
I mean, there's definitely a few things. And as I come from an operational background, and I just joined ALNAP a couple of years ago, and actually that privilege of having the space to sit back and reflect, which you realize that most of the humanitarian sector don't have that space to reflect and learn. We have a very delivery-oriented sector. And we always, when we're producing this report, feel slightly anxious that we're not going to have anything new to say, because, have things actually changed since the last report or not? But actually, each report definitely represents a different stage of evolution of the sector. So the previous report was much more around the coming together of multiple stakeholders for policy commitments and policy frameworks like the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, etc. And this report really, this period is really much more about the realization of how difficult it is to implement those commitments, and particularly when you have a very complex operating environment like we have had over the last few years. I think there's a couple of things that really stuck out for me in the report. One is this issue of the concentration of resources. From and to very few players, which is in stark contrast to the decolonization discussions that are kind of gaining momentum within the sector, which is all about a more diverse and inclusive sector. And that's really at odds, and the fact that trend is continuing doesn't appear to be what the sector wants, and yet that's the direction we're heading. The other one that I wanted to pick up on, which was in my presentation, was the issue of the 73% of aid recipients who feel that they are treated with dignity and respect, which is really positive. Obviously, we would want it to be 100%, but it feels very positive. But it was higher than I expected, given that we are so self-critical about the levels of participation and in engagement that we managed to achieve, and that was borne out in our assessment as well. And I think that also suggests to us that there's quite a lot that we don't understand about how aid recipients feel about our engagement with them, and the issue of dignity and respect are actually quite complex concepts.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, as you look at the report, for you and your colleagues, what are some of the themes or things that you rely on as you look at this data, as you think through what policy changes or ways that the U.S. government can do work better?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, again, huge thank you to Juliet, you and the team that put this report together. I think it is invaluable to have organizations like ALNAP that are able to step back, are able to do objective comparisons over time, are able to provide us with kind of benchmarks to start to think about project progress and really put real data behind it. I mean, we are still diving into this report across BHA, but we take the findings very, very seriously. And one of them that sticks out to me is at least as a matter of percentage, if not top line figures, we really haven't made the progress on localization that I think we would all like to see. And this is something that we've really been digging in on at BHA over the last many years, but I'd say aggressively over the last year and a half. And in digging in on our own practice, I think we've found a couple of things, and I really do hope people take a look at the localization policy that's out for comment right now. One is this kind of work really requires a different kind of donor model, and it is very staff dependent on the donor side, and it's something I hear a lot from my fellow donors. I'm actually more optimistic about us in the US government being able to make progress on this space because we do have a model of having a lot of US government officials in country that can do the hard work of working with local partners to bring them on as real partners, not contractors. But we're, for example, we've had a big push this past year in DRC to, really try and move the ball on how many local partners, how much funding is going through local partners there, and it's been a real eye-opener in some of the bureaucratic constraints that we've put in place over the years to actually moving funding. We have brought on 3 new local partners, and in DRC as direct beneficiaries of our assistance, with more coming in the coming months. But it's just one example of, we have the policy framework that's out right now, but we're also undertaking really a revision of our award processes and our award guidance with a real focus on simplification and moving resources directly to local partners.
Yeah, I mean, because the localization conversation, it isn't new, right? I mean, it may be a higher focus, but I was, when you said this conversation is still ongoing, I was thinking, I feel like we've been talking about this for a long time, and it's hopeful to hear, that there's some headway, but it's hard to be a partner for the U.S. government because of all the rightful, regulations in place when you're using U.S. tax dollars. Anything else that you want to speak to in terms of localization, whether it's getting funding directly from the U.S. government or other donors, anything else in terms of what local partners face or what they could do, better to continue to ramp up localization efforts? Anything more we want to add to that conversation?
I mean, maybe I'd just add beyond what we're doing to try and move bilateral funds directly to local partners. I mean, I think there has been progress on things like country-based pooled funds, which have proven particularly again for donors that don't necessarily have the manpower to do a lot of direct awards, a good mechanism for channeling funds to local partners. But like many of these things, like anticipatory action, like localization, it's about scale as well as intention.
Yeah, we've been at ALNAP, we've been doing quite a lot of work this year also on trying to understand better how and when the humanitarian sector learns and changes and when it doesn't, to try and really understand, what we can see from the State of the Humanitarian System report where we're making progress, but like why? Why is it that some things are taking off and other things aren't? And what we found is that there's kind of two camps. There's the technical sector-specific initiatives where you can see a beautiful learning trajectory over time, where the sector is getting better and better at, things like treatment of malnutrition, health provision, all these sorts of things, and it comes out in the State of the Humanitarian System report. But there are these intractable learning challenges where we're stuck. And it's basically accountability to affected populations, localization, and linking relief and development, where if you look back on the evaluations of 20 years ago, you can find that the recommendations are almost word for word the same. Yeah. So we're stuck on these particular, they're cross-cutting, they require collective action, and they also require a fundamental shift and rethink about the power balances within the sector. And it's really difficult to do, and we're kind of stuck on them, which is why we noted within the State of the Humanitarian System report, the narrative is getting stronger around localization. The assumption that it's a good thing, that it needs to happen, is getting stronger, and the commitments to it are getting stronger and stronger, which is an important part of the shift. But it's not the same as working out what the answer is. But I think the country-based pool funds is a really excellent potential, and we can see where it's working well. It's working really well. But there's plenty of criticism of it as well from the local actors in particular. So it's not a magic bullet, but it does give one example. But we need more space for this experimentation, and also to recognize that localization doesn't fit well with the incentive structures of our sector. And that's one of the challenges, is actually it needs us to shift the incentive structures, particularly for the international actors, in order to actually create that shift. And that's why the stuff that BHA are doing on localization is excellent. It's pushing the agenda, but we need to, it's never going to be an easy fix.
Yeah. And you brought up, the power balance. I mean, certainly it's, again, also nothing new for the United States to be such a leader in this, but the percentage, I mean, when you were talking about up to 45% as far as the primary donor, I mean, that is...
The fiscal year for some of my fellow donors isn't over, so I'm hoping in the last 6-8 weeks we'll see some moves from fellow donors, but right now that's what it looks like.
And you said in your remarks, it's unsustainable, and so for a lot of our audience members here, particularly those online, we have a lot of people that work within the U.S. government, whether it's Congress or, for the donor, what is, for them, what should they be thinking through in terms of how do we really shift this too? Because we obviously, not just a moral obligation, we're a great leader in this space, we want to continue to be a great leader in this space, but how do you really shift that dynamic? I'll look to you first in terms of what do you do to really try to engage more of not just the non-traditional donors like the philanthropic and the diaspora, which is also important, but what about other countries that really need to step up to the plate or who are pulling back?
Yeah, and I would say, one thing that's driving that difference in the report between the U.S. having maybe 30% of the share to this year probably having more like 40+% of that share is I think we've had tremendous bipartisan support in Congress over the last couple of years that has recognized the humanitarian imperative, and even there's been a lot of attention on kind of the distraction of the Ukraine conflict and how it's diverted resources from other crises. I think that's the case for around most of the world. It's not the case for the US government. I mean, there actually has been a tail, so to speak, on Ukraine supplemental funding. The Congress recognized that there was a global impact of Russia's war on Ukraine, and so provided $4.3 billion in additional funding, really geared towards responding in the rest of the world to this crisis. So I think we've seen a generosity from the U.S. Congress. We've seen that move beyond just a Ukraine-focused response to really be global in nature. But as I look around the world at other donors, we're seeing a very different dynamic. And I actually think one of the stories of maybe not that period that ends in 2021, but 2022 and 2023, is it's not just the retreat of the non-traditional donors, which we've seen over the last couple of years, but the retreat of some of the traditional donors. Obviously, the kind of step back of FCDO being the most dramatic.
Can you explain what that means?
The UK government's kind of walk away from their 0.7 commitments has been the most dramatic, and what we've felt kind of around the world, and particularly in the Horn, I'd say, where they were such a catalytic donor during the last drought in 2016, 2017. But also we're seeing even Nordic donors who've been such stalwarts, looking at reductions in the coming years. So again, I think there's an imperative for us to look, one, to continue working these kind of traditional and non-traditional donors, making the case for humanitarian action, but also, again, when I look at humanitarian needs, there's a lot in there that wasn't in there a decade, 15, 20 years ago. And it reflects what you've been talking about in terms of these are protracted crises, and people's needs move beyond life-saving assistance. And so, looking at new models for how do we provide for social safety nets in crisis, how do we look to other actors to support sustained basic service delivery. When I talk to our team about the Horn, I'm talking to them as much, and I'm talking as much to counterparts at the banks as I am to fellow donors, because what we need is more shock-resistant social safety net investments, not just kind of, quote, humanitarian investments.
Is there more you want to add to that, as well as I want to ask you if for, especially I'm thinking of congressional staffers who may be online watching this today, what should they be paying attention to? If they don't know, they haven't been working deep in the humanitarian sector, what's the one key issue they should be thinking about for any brief they have to write for someone in Congress?
Well, maybe I can build on a couple of Sarah's points as well. I mean, one of the great things about the US being such a significant donor is that actually they have, they play a massive role in the formation and the well-functioning and the future performance of the sector. So where the US decides to prioritize and lead on something, it has a huge influence for change within the sector, which is massively positive. And we see lots of good examples. Localization is a good example. Anticipatory action is another good example, for example. But that dependence on few actors also makes the sector very vulnerable.
Yeah.
Which becomes a cause for concern, because great when things are going well, but when things aren't going so well, actually it can be massively negatively impactful for the sector, which is really important. Also, Sarah touched on this issue about, and I mentioned in my presentation, the ambition of the humanitarian sector is also growing. Yeah. So we know that the humanitarian sector delivers response programming very well, and that there's good evidence of effectiveness there. But actually the mandate of the humanitarian sector is growing, and the longer-term nature of crises, recurrent crises, requires much more focus on longer-term community resilience and recovery programming. And there's a question about where it sits, and that's where the humanitarian development peace nexus is really important. But our findings were that people at a project level or a program level, they don't get it. It's not resonating as a concept, it's not enabling them to create better linkages. And also, like our conversations with some of the development actors when we were preparing this report, demonstrated that it's not obvious to them that they need to step into that space. So we're kind of, we're stuck with this lost ground, the no man's land between humanitarian and development, and it's not obvious that we'll be able to resource it or that anybody else will necessarily step into that space. In terms of, and then I forgot your question.
Oh, I was thinking about like a congressional staffer who might be watching online who doesn't know a lot about the humanitarian space, but if they have to think about what's important to their, the member of Congress that they work for, what should members of Congress be paying attention to? They're not going to read the whole report, so what's the few things that they should, pay attention to?
So, localization is definitely one that comes up all the way through the report, but I think anticipatory action is also this other one. We know that timeliness makes a difference, and now we have a growing body of evidence, not everybody thinks we needed the evidence because it seemed obvious to many, but evidence that actually that also improves the effectiveness of programming. And then these missed opportunities when it isn't working, like, East Africa is a heartbreaking example now. Like, why, with everything that we know, with the cyclical nature of these crises, why isn't it automatic that everything should kick in just in the right way with all this learning? And we have plenty of learning. Learning is not the blockage with these sorts of crises, and I think that's a really important point that comes out quite strongly.
Yeah. I'd like to turn to the audience in person first to get some of your questions. I think we have some microphone runners that will be at the back. I'll also, of course, turn to some questions that have been submitted online. But if you just want to raise your hand if you have a question in the audience, I'll take 3 at a time. Oh, don't be shy now. Here we go. Let's do one. Yeah, right there is fine. And then we'll come to the one in the front. Can you stand up, please, and can you just give your name and affiliation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service. You were just speaking about what should congressional staffers know to report to the principals they're working for. I think the key word some of you mentioned was accountability. I know from my experience in government, there's a lot of paperwork involved in accountability. And sometimes there are different standards of accountability. I wonder, has there been given much thought to development of common accountability standards and regulations? So in reports that have to be filed to satisfy USAID and the Congress, the United Nations, the EU, Germany, Japan, the other donors, has there been any thought about trying to develop a common standard of accountability? So one report from a recipient agency could satisfy a lot of donors.
Great, thank you so much. Other questions? Okay, Harim, oh, sorry, go ahead. Harim, right in the back, and if you can see way over there, there's a woman. Yeah, she's coming. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. To what extent can you bring in the internet to hold meetings virtually with the local people and the donors to get their participation and get an economic consensus of what they want to do on each project?
Okay, great, thank you. And in the very back here, and then we'll turn to our speakers next. Go ahead, please.
I'm Megan Lopez with Global Support and Development. So I have a question. I think it was really interesting, the point that you made that the humanitarian sector is good at response programming. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I wonder, are we actually good at that, or is it just easier to measure? And is it not perhaps that by not addressing localization that we sort of perpetuate that myth that that's something that we're good at? And then related to that, how do we see the role, if we think about everyone in this room, or going back to your question about the U.S. congressional staffers, what role do we see it taking towards looking at the solutions that are out there and have been talked about for some time, whether we're talking about Grand Bargain or Pledge for Change, or a lot of the efforts that have come out of the Global South? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Sarah, we'll start with you. Respond as you wish to those questions.
Yeah, well, maybe first on the promise of the internet. I mean, I think a lot of challenges came out of the COVID experience, of course, but one of them was as if there needed to be more evidence, and I don't think there did, to convince us. It really was an opportunity to shine a spotlight on just the critical role of local responders in these crises in a time when travel restrictions kind of shook up the humanitarian response model, and it's also allowed, I would say, much easier in some ways consultation with, engagement with, work with local partners. And in fact, as we've brought on more local partners in DRC, we've been able to do a lot more, take advantage a lot more of bringing kind of Washington to DRC to help work through those very complicated processes with local partners, even while we try to make our processes less complicated. And on that point, in terms of accountability, I mean, I think one of the reasons why our award making has become so cumbersome, one of the barriers to kind of moving resources to local partners is that, every time there's an OIG report, we we add more reporting requirements, more due diligence, more restrictions, and that's for very good reason. But one thing we're doing inside of BHA right now is taking a hard look at which of these processes and procedures provide value, actually help mitigate risk, and which are just barriers to entry, and how do we rationalize and simplify that, because we both need to be accountable. I think we all in this sector want to make sure assistance is getting where it's intended to go, and that we're able to demonstrate that, monitor that. But we also know that many of the kind of policies that have piled up over the years are probably not serving their intended purpose anymore. So it's a big part of us trying to rationalize it. And then, the question of we're good at response. I mean, I think we can be self-critical. I think that's a really healthy aspect of the humanitarian system, that we really are made up of individuals that are quite good at questioning, probing, trying to improve the sector, and recognize areas where there has been tremendous progress. I mean, I think the shift to cash, we hear time and time again from people, is responsive to what they want. I think we have seen real, measurable, concrete improvements in the ability for communities to sustain, to survive and recover from sudden onset disasters. And that really is because of, improvements in the way that we work. And like Juliet said, I think there have been, real improvements in delivery of things like malnutrition treatment, which is not to say we don't need to, again, hold ourselves accountable and continue to make real progress on accountability to affected populations and on localization.
Would you like to respond to any of those questions?
Well, I think Sarah addressed them all very well. So just a couple of things to add, I suppose. I think the issue of pooled due diligence processes is a really interesting one. And there are some small pilots happening where, if a local organization has submitted its compliance and due diligence accountability processes for one agency or one donor, they can be used by others. But they're very small number of pilots, given that it's so often quoted as a barrier to entry into the system by local actors. And it's because, the sector faces these dual accountabilities that they just can't manage to match. But there is, certainly from the donors that I hear from, there's a commitment to try and find better ways of doing things, but the pilots are currently still very small. I think, the good at response programming, or is it easier to measure, is a great question. The reality is, from covering the State of the Humanitarian System reports over the last 12, 15 years, is that the humanitarian system is now providing aid effectively to more people in more complex environments than it ever has before. So if that's a metric of success, it's doing it well. I think that issue about is it easier to measure is really interesting, because going through this process of compiling the report, it's extremely frustrating. The number of things that we can't look at, can't establish, and can't say, because as a sector we're not good enough at collecting the meaningful data, or sometimes sharing that data is also a challenge. We have a lot of goodwill behind this report, and we access an amazing amount of data, but there's still lots that we can't access, which really compromises the sector's overall ability to know how it's doing.
Can you give an example of that? Like, what's some of the data that you would love to have that you don't have? Broadly. I don't know, maybe that's too sensitive,
Can I suggest that if people would like to talk about that, they talk to Alice, who's the reporter.
Sure. Alice, raise your hand. During the coffee break, talk to Alice. I will be. Okay, go ahead.
Because it's really complicated.
Gotcha, okay.
And I think that, and cash is the other excellent example. We've seen cash increase from 14% to 20% with really strong outcome measurements, really strong effectiveness measurements. And then the question for the sector is, do you keep progressing that, knowing that it makes such a huge difference?
Yeah. There's a few questions from online that I want to get to. One is for you, Juliet, and then the other I think can be both. This one is, can you share, your slide talking about how 40% of the funding was from other. what percentage of that would come from China? Do you know that? Is that maybe too specific?
Oh, that's probably too specific, but
Okay.
I highly recommend you read the report.
Well, that gives a good answer in and of itself.
It's tiny.
That's what I figured, yes.
Tiny, tiny, tiny. We really tried to dig into this,
Mm-hmm.
and it is almost negligible.
Got it. Okay. That gives me a good answer. And this is a question for both of you. I know it's hard to say like what the next ALNAP report would look like. However, looking at the current trends, you know, and again, it's impossible to pull out a crystal ball and just project this, but what are you seeing in the trends right now of what you expect us to be in terms of where we're going to be doing well or not so well in the next 5 years? What do you think and what do you think? Sarah, first on that.
Wow, crystal ball.
Right. What do we
Maybe a couple of issues. One, I think we were talking in the green room about return of the middle-income countries on the list. I spent this summer in the Horn, in Kenya and Somalia, in the Philippines, in Pakistan, and you add places like Kenya, Pakistan, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. These are countries that we didn't think about as, I mean, Lebanon is a refugee hosting country, but you know, even 5-6 years ago, these weren't countries where we were thinking about significant humanitarian needs. And they're very much back on the list, and they're back on the list not because of issues of capacity, but because of issues of either governance or issues of financing, and issues of just the overwhelming impact of climate, particularly in the cases of Kenya and Pakistan. So I think certainly climate is going to loom even larger than it did in this report. And then the other thing I would say is, you know, we've been talking a lot about financing, the share of financing. I've been talking about the retreat of non-traditional and traditional donors. But even within that retreat, I think there is a recognition that the humanitarian needs are significant and a desire to protect humanitarian budgets inside of broader budget cuts. We're seeing this with FCDO, with the UK government. We're seeing this with some of my Nordic counterparts. But I think we're going to feel the cost of that down the road, because what's getting cut is development budgets. And as much as there's still a lot of work to be done in the nexus, there are places, and we know that those resilience investments, those ag investments, those investments in climate smart infrastructure, that they are so related to the humanitarian needs down the road. And so while there's, you know, part of me when I talk to my counterparts and they say things like, well, our humanitarian budgets won't be that impacted. It's really going to come from the development side of the house. You know, it's like, okay, that makes some of my calculation in the very near term a little bit easier, but I see the looming cost of that walk back from development investments that we'll be feeling for, you know, decades to come.
Yeah. What are the current trends that you're seeing, and what do you think for?
Well, I think the climate change one is obviously very significant. And I think one of the interesting things from a kind of learning and performance point of view is actually one of the implications of the climate change stuff is that the humanitarian sector is going to have to get faster at adapting. Because actually what we've seen is that the humanitarian sector's ability to learn and evolve over time is comparatively slow and incremental. But actually the reality of climate change is the unpredictable nature of the crises we'll be facing will mean that we need to be able to process and act on data much quicker, and on real-time learning and all those sorts of processes to be able to be flexible and adaptable enough to respond to these new types of crises. The other thing that I wanted to pick up, which Sarah did mention earlier, was also access.
Yeah.
You know, that's one of the really worrying trends that has gone on, you know, beyond just this reporting period, is around humanitarian space and access. And that's been a long-term trend, which we may reasonably expect to become more challenging in this next reporting period, and really compromising the ability of the humanitarian sector to deliver assistance. And I think one of the challenges to that is that a lot of the solution to that sits outside of the humanitarian sector, and it requires leadership and unity from the international community, without which we're going to continue to see this erosion of humanitarian norms. and space.
There's a question that actually ties in directly to what we're talking about from online, and it says the question's for Sarah, but I think either of you might answer it. But it says, you highlighted the need to support adaptation efforts for community most affected by climate change. So what is USAID's position on providing funding for loss and damage to help communities affected by climate change recover and rebuild?
So I will say USAID's position is really the US government position on this, which is our dual focus is really on mitigation, so bringing down emissions, working around the world to bring down emissions, and also significantly increasing our investments in adaptation. So this was announced last year, the President's emergency plan for climate change called PREPARE, which really is focused on increasing, trying to reach 500 million of the most vulnerable over the next several years with adaptation resources, again, focused on getting those resources to those that are most likely to be impacted by the worst impacts of climate change. And USAID and BHA are a big part of that adaptation work, and in BHA in particular at models for moving resources not just through kind of government systems, but at a very local level to help communities think about, make decisions, and prepare for climate impacts.
No. Anything you want to add? No. Let's take one or two final questions from the audience. Hareem, there's a woman in the green jacket right there. Okay, I see you over there. Let's come all the way to this side. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Marie-Rose Murphy from the Haiti Community Foundation. I have a question in terms of accountability and actually evaluation. Is there any question or any section when it comes to grantees that's related to accountability to communities? And if there isn't, how do you measure the progress on localization? So that's one. The other thing is, I actually read a summary of the ALNAP report, and actually I was one of the people interviewed for it. And my understanding is that there was, actually in terms of funding to local actors, it went down to 1.2%. Okay. I still haven't been able to swallow that, but at any rate. And I have to ask why, because one of the things that I worry about is some of these numbers. I worry about, for example, when we talk about cash is, and cash is good, don't get me wrong, better cash than having goods coming and disrupting economies and with extremely low procurement levels when it comes to the growth of local economies and increasing dependence on aid, which, as we know, doesn't help. But then when you scratch, you start seeing that basically as far as localization or in terms of local actors, global South actors control, you have more and more sort of UN agencies and INGOs getting this cash, controlling these cash problems. So part of me is like, does anybody see it as a problem? And if it is there a way of moving toward that? And I realize it's multiple questions, but there's a part of me that feels like, where is the accountability system to the communities? Because basically, if aid is not about ending the need for aid, what are we doing? And if it isn't in there, it needs to be in there. And then the other part of it is that, can we sort of scratch under the surface and then see what's really going on? Because we talk about sustainability, and given the climate change and everything that's going on, it is completely unrealistic that people do not have a full, or agencies, localization agenda, which we all know that a lot of us, Global South, hate that term, but for whatever it is, we're stuck with it for now.
Thank you very much. Question over here, and then we only have time for one more question, and we'll go to the back, right over here. Go ahead.
Hello, good morning. Maurizio Geri from Italy. I work for NATO. My question is about the future trends besides climate security, also regarding refugees, because of the demographic bomb in Africa, particularly in the Mediterranean. If you see also the need of increasing cooperation between civilian and military actors, meaning that in NATO at least we see that in the trends in the future it will increase these humanitarian missions, military missions that will need maybe a cooperation with the civilian actors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and just bring the microphone right over there to the woman at the back. Thank you so much. You have to do lightning answers, but we'll get to it.
Thank you so
Go
much.
ahead.
I'm Stanislava with the Center for Human Rights Humanitarian Studies at Brown. Just to add on to my NATO colleague's question on your interaction with militaries, you mentioned access, climate change, increasing conflict. How has the increasing nexus between development and humanitarian assistance changed the sector's relationship, not just with militaries, but private security companies, local police, international and host nation militaries? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Who would like to begin? It was a lot to cover.
Could I pick up on the localization?
Yes, yes.
Because I think it's a brilliant question, and it's
Yeah.
really localization is clearly really problematic.
Yeah.
The sector say they want it, they believe it'll make the sector better and stronger, they believe it'll improve the quality of assistance,
But yet, what was it, 1.2%?
yeah, the overall proportion is good. And I think that's an issue of the incentive structures and the way that our sector is structured. So we've done this kind of learning piece that's coming out in a few weeks to try and understand why the learning has progressed in some areas, not others that I mentioned earlier. And one of those, I think, is around incentives for the sector to change and the actors within the sector to change. What we can see with localization is these bubbling learning and adaptation and change happening at a project level, but as it starts to coalesce, it hits what we call the institutional permafrost across the middle of the sector, which is basically our international institutions who actually are somewhat resistant or unable to change and adapt, and that we don't actually have the incentive structures in place in order to enable that change that we want. Because localization is complex, it means relinquishing power, it means changing the way that we're doing things. And when you link it to kind of evaluation and stuff, I mean, one of the things that we know is that international institutions get better and better at proving why what they're doing is good. And so, you know, the sector will quickly find ways to look more localized without necessarily addressing those fundamental shifts that are required. And that's difficult within institutions. The institutions are battling and grappling with that at an individual institutional level as well as collectively.
Great, thank you. Sarah, final thoughts as well as reactions to some of the questions.
Sure, maybe I'll, a couple of reactions. One on the question of kind of engaging with private security, military actors, militias, and others. Certainly one of the themes, I mean, access means so many different things. It's very difficult to unpack, but one of the themes in so many of the places that we're supporting partners to work is a need for much more technical expertise, presence on the ground, and tactical engagement with armed actors. And it's one of our top priorities with OCHA is to expand their kind of civil military capabilities. It's also, we have a partnership with NRC to help support and train NGOs on how to engage at that very tactical level with military actors. It's of course kind of a growing trend. I think this question about the tension between the move to cash and localization is such a good and rich one. One way that it's been coming up in our engagement in a number of different settings is, you know, there are places where you have these, I don't know if this is exactly what you have in mind, but where you have these national social safety net programs, and we have humanitarian multi-purpose cash existing alongside or in the same places. And in some places, there are very good reasons for that. In other places, we're really pressing on our partners, pressing on the humanitarian country team to articulate and distinguish between what should and could be going through humanitarian systems and what we really should be supporting national and local system responses to. And that goes back to kind of this conversation that needs to be much more systematic between, the multilateral development banks, again, in a place like Somalia or Ukraine, where there are these kind of existing government systems and where that kind of very targeted humanitarian cash could or should be used. But I also hear you on the percentage of funding moving to local actors is a huge, I think a black eye on the system. And it's one of the reasons, again, why we're so focused not on kind of the policy is out on the street, we want your feedback, but not just the policy, but the systems and the practice that are going to shift the movement of resources in that space. Because I think there is sometimes a disconnect between what we agree in theory and policy, and then building the systems that actually allow us to move the agenda forward.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I hope you stick around. You see the program. There's going to be a lot of great discussions we're having today. For now, we're going to take about a 10-minute break, get some coffee, stretch your legs, keep the conversation going with our panelists, with each other, and we'll see you back in this room at 10:30 for the open plenary. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. So those who are getting coffee, get a refill and come back in. In about 2 minutes, we're going to get started. So please find your seats. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats and we'll get started. Welcome back, everyone, for the plenary panel for the second Humanitarian Forum at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Whether you're joining us here in person or online, we are grateful for you to be here. For those of us that joined us for our introductory discussion this morning, we talked about the state of the humanitarian sector, including ALNAP's State of the Sector report. We also talked with Sarah Charles from USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs. We covered a lot of ground, including some of the issues around localization, the funding gap that we continue to see, and now the conversation continues. This conversation will be led by Beza Tesfaye. She's a senior associate with the CSIS Project on Fragility and Mobility. Beza, Batama Masaganalu for leading this. Thank you. Over to you.
Kimberly, and good morning to all of you here in the audience. Also, good morning to everyone who's joining us virtually. As Kimberly mentioned, I'm Beza Tesfaye. I'm affiliated with the Program on Fragility and Mobility here at CSIS. I'm also Director of Research and Learning for Climate Change and Migration at Mercy Corps, which is an international development and humanitarian organization. I'm extremely honored to be moderating this discussion on the changing humanitarian landscape, and we are privileged to have with us both here in person and virtually 4 exceptional panelists, and I really mean that have been working for many years in many different ways to help improve the effectiveness of the humanitarian sector and its ability to respond to communities in crises. Our panelists have a rich and diverse set of experiences and backgrounds, and I'm really eager to exchange and engage with them. But before introducing them, I just want to very, very briefly share a few of my own thoughts to help frame the discussion. As we sit here this morning, we're all aware that the world is in a state of significant financial, political, and ecological turbulence, which of course has implications for the humanitarian sector and our ability to respond to humanitarian needs. The United Nations estimates that in 2022, over 200 million people worldwide require humanitarian assistance, and only a third of the resources needed to respond, which is a record $48.7 billion, only a third of this has been met. This is by far the largest shortfall in humanitarian finance that we have ever seen. But as you can observe in this graph, this gap has expanded gradually over the years, even as humanitarian finance has steadily increased over the same time period. Why are we seeing this growing gap, and how do we respond? These are some of the critical questions that this panel will discuss. And obviously, there are many avenues from which we can try to discuss this challenge, but I want to highlight just a couple of entry points for our conversation. First, humanitarian needs are primarily driven by complex, protracted crises. So if you look at this map, which displays all of the active UN humanitarian appeals from 2022, you'll notice something. Many of the countries with active humanitarian appeals are affected by conflict or insecurity. Several are also highly climate vulnerable, characterized by low levels of adaptive capacity and high exposure to climate-related disasters. These are countries that we generally refer to as fragile countries. Importantly, while it's less apparent from this map, humanitarian appeals for these fragile countries have been active for several consecutive years. 10 years for Haiti, Mali, Niger, Yemen, 15 years for Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, and Chad, and an astonishing 20 consecutive years for the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and Sudan. So it's evident that the humanitarian sector really has to think about how we address the challenge of fragility. A second entry point for our discussion is around opportunities for engaging new partners. There is untapped potential to work more with the private sector as well as with local responders, including civil society and NGOs, to help expand and increase the effectiveness of humanitarian responses. And while this opportunity has been long recognized, we continue to struggle with establishing equitable long-term partnerships that translate into deep engagement with non-traditional actors. So as you can see, there's much to discuss, and I would love to bring in our panelists to help me think and discuss these issues. But first, let me briefly introduce our speakers. To my left is Maria Kisumbi, who is Director of Policy and Government Relations at Humanity United. Maria is a Ugandan that was born in Tanzania and raised in Kampala, Uganda, where she spent 11 years of her early professional career. Prior to joining Humanity, Maria was a senior human rights and governance technical advisor for the Uganda National Planning Authority at the German Development Cooperation. She has a master's degree in global health law from Georgetown, a bachelor of law from Makerere University, and a postgraduate diploma from the Law Development Center in Uganda. To my far left is Sadie Bynum, who is the Global Emergency Response Manager at Airbnb.org. Sadie joined Airbnb.org in 2021. Prior to that, she was appointed Director of the Philadelphia Office of Emergency Management in 2018. She was also a presidential appointee under the Obama and Trump administrations, where she was deployed to manage and respond to several large-scale incidences as a federal coordinating officer. Sadie has also served as a Director of Emergency Preparedness for the New York City Housing Authority and the New York City Office of Emergency Management. And she's also served as a public safety advisor to the Chief Executive Officer of DeKalb County, Georgia. And then joining us virtually, we have Andre Kern, who is head of the International Organizations and Humanitarian Agenda at the World Economic Forum. Andre leads efforts to deepen and co-design multi-stakeholder collaboration between the World Economic Forum and international organizations to tackle key global challenges for a more sustainable future. He focuses on bringing together humanitarian and development actors with corporations and investors to design long-term approaches in protracted settings that combine humanitarian impact with financial returns. Andre has also formerly served on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia and the EU delegation to the State of Israel. Finally, we have Chaland Kulubo-Waria, who is the founder and managing director of Warand Advisory Center. Chaland has 18 years of experience providing strategic leadership and management and technical assistance to local, international, and national development organizations. She has worked in a wide range of sectors, including youth development, governance, and sustainable livelihoods. Her work has extended across Africa, and recently, Chalande has played a leadership role in a nationwide consultative process to develop national standards of competence and sustainability for NGOs in Kenya. Welcome to all of you. We are really grateful to have you here with us. I would like to turn to you first, Andre, and have you sort of share some opening remarks with us and tell us a bit about your work. And specifically, as I mentioned, we are in the situation where we see enormous humanitarian finance gaps and growing needs. So would love if you could tell us a bit about the role of the World Economic Forum and how the forum is fostering dialogues, partnerships to address this challenge. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Beza. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. Good morning and good afternoon from Geneva. I would actually start that perhaps framing this as closing the funding gap may not be the starting point where we're trying to engage with a lot of these new traditional voices. We may speak about this, especially from the perspective of the private sector. I think from our view, it's really about how do we build collaboration, but also support coexistence in areas where we can jointly address fragility and, as you had mentioned, protracted crises. For us, it's really about how do we complement some of the more traditional relief efforts together with more sustainable and long-term approach through investments in areas that strengthen the resilience of communities, but also help to recover, rebuild, or strengthen local markets. And for that to happen, we really believe that more closer collaboration, more coordinated collaboration between the humanitarian ecosystem, foundations, development finance institutions, corporates, and investors really have the potential to unlock more financially sustainable models that address some of these long-term systemic challenges. And I want to say this in kind of the three main trends or movements that we've been observing since being involved in this space. And I think the first one, and a lot of this was already discussed in the opening, is the kind of more opening of working with new partners, especially also business, in delivering humanitarian action. I think accompanied with that has also been quite a lot of experimentation and by now successful implementation of sort of new financing models by the humanitarian ecosystem. But what we're seeing is that a lot of this, because of the nature of the responsiveness side, it remains reactionary. A lot of it is still short term. It kind of it stops too often at a pilot stage. And I think we can be honest to say that's not applicable to all geographies. I think the type of response in Ukraine is not necessarily the type of response, especially in terms of how businesses come in, that we would be able to emulate in other parts of the world to the same extent. And that sort of collaboration, while it's a positive momentum, it opens new areas of working together. I think still puts us within that kind of aid perspective and support and funding through the humanitarian ecosystem. Now, the other two trends that we've been engaging with is, of course, the shift and the various strategies accompanied by this of the development finance community into more fragile contexts. And I think we've seen also positive mobilization of DFIs working more closely together. That goes hand in hand, I think, with the growing appetite among some different types of investors to really understand where and how they could deploy their capital for greater societal or environmental impact. And these two trends combined, I think, puts us a little bit more into kind of an investment perspective that is long-term, that looks at more commercially driven investments, perhaps more in alignment with the humanitarian ecosystem. Now, what has the forum done? How have we been engaged? We are an international organization for public-private cooperation. And we've really been involved in the space, really in the lead up and since the World Humanitarian Summit. And there's been a couple of different areas that we've tried to stimulate both dialogue, but also active collaboration between the public and the private sector. Before the World Humanitarian Summit, we already had actually a really interesting collaboration between our supply chain partners, and WFP is the head of the logistics cluster. It's called the Logistics Emergency Teams. And that collaboration, first informal, that has now been formalized, continues. And it's really about deploying assets, services, and people from those companies in support of the logistics cluster at any given crisis when it gets activated. For a number of years, we had what we call the Global Future Council on Humanitarian Action that was co-chaired by Peter Maurer and Tara Nathan, which really was our incubator to bring together donors, humanitarian agencies, businesses, foundations, to think about new approaches, new collaboration in these areas of fragility. And most recently, the Council produced a number of guidelines for complementary action in fragile contexts, really, I think, underpinning the need for closer collaboration between the two sectors, but also early collaboration to really understand how each can bring their own expertise, skill sets, and assets to this mix. At a higher level, we've leveraged our big convenings, such as the annual meeting in Davos, where we've traditionally had now for a number of years a humanitarian agenda, and that's been really to get direct exposure and access between these various sectors at a principal level, at a CEO level, to discuss about some of the challenges, but also to really have frank exchanges about the appetites to collaborate or enter some of these more difficult environments and what needs to happen as a result. And as a final point, really our sort of main initiative has been the Humanitarian and Resilience Investing Initiative that we launched together with the ICRC and the World Bank back in 2019 at Davos, in a way as the backdrop of these three major trends starting to converge. And what we mean by HRI, or Humanitarian Resilience Investing, is really capital that is invested in ways that has a measurable humanitarian societal impact, but provides some level of financial return. And for that, it was quite important for us that we had the word investment in order to drive the conversation as an expansion of the broader humanitarian finance discussions that were happening. But we also wanted to make sure that this was really focused on building and growing sustainable business models that are not necessarily over time grant dependent and take away from, I would say, the core humanitarian budgets as you try to scale some of those models. And for us, in trying to drive this approach has been really the importance to look at how do you collaborate, who plays what role, and who deploys what types of resources along the entire value chain of the pipeline development. So how do you start from an idea with sort of an innovative finance in mind, and how do you drive that to market? We're not saying that this is an area that should replace. It's really about complementarity. And it is about trying to figure out where you can strengthen that public-private collaboration in areas where we know fragility and instability will persist in different forms because of different shocks. And I think climate is just the latest on top of everything else. But really, how do you work together and support those collaborations in a way to unlock private capital in those fragile contexts as a way to enable further concentration of traditional humanitarian funding in really the most acute crisis.
I do want to come back to some of the points that you mentioned, including how do you get private sector investment flowing to fragile contexts, and would love to hear more about the Humanitarian Resilience Initiative specifically. But now let me turn it over to Maria to get your opening remarks and your thoughts about how we can think about addressing these challenges. Specifically, we've been discussing the issue of fragility, the fact that a lot of these crises that we're seeing are driven by a number of environmental, political, conflict-related challenges that are affecting fragile states. So how is humanity thinking about this challenge, and how are you all engaging to respond?
Thank you, Beza. So maybe before I talk about how we as Humanity United respond within fragile contexts, a little bit about Humanity United. So we are a philanthropic organization that exists to cultivate conditions that advance peace and freedom. And the conditions we're looking at are agency, shared humanity, responsive and accountable institutions. And even I would like us to take a step back as to why and how we respond. And Beza did a very good job of setting the stage, the tone, and even the previous panel discussion is the moment we are in. COVID-19 very clearly showed the system inequities. It showed how local actors respond to these humanitarian situations. I remember the previous panel, someone was saying a lot of the actors left, and it was the local actors who were responding to these different humanitarian situations. Then the other is the call for decolonization of development. We saw the brokenness of the aid system. And taking into consideration all these, we as Humanity United were able to sit back and revisit how we want to engage within this context. We took into consideration the pandemic, the rise of autocracy, and we also took into consideration DEIJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. With all that in mind, we as Humanity United, how we are responding is we are really on an active journey on devolving power to those closest who are facing conflict and exploitation. 2, we are really honoring lived experience and the agency of those closest to the issues. And then the 3rd is we really want to practice trust-based approach to philanthropy. What is trust-based approach to philanthropy? It's really changing the way how we do business, changing how we respond to situations, changing how we relate with our partners, and building trust and really advancing equity within these relationships. And lastly, I hope I'll be able to talk about it, is accompaniment, which is really a core principle of how do we as private funders engage within this context, because the actors closest to the ground, they understand the complexities, the nuance. There's some things from far here, I sit in DC, actually I sit in Baltimore, which we can't even see. And it's important for us within the private institutions to realize that and see what role is it that we play. I thrive best when our partners have the necessary resources and tools that they need to be able to respond to the situations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. A lot of great ideas there, and we will have a chance to dig into them, including accompaniment, as you mentioned. Shifting gears just a little bit, I want to bring Sadie into the conversation, and we're really lucky to have you with us, Sadie, because you offer a perspective having worked closely with the private sector, and I think Airbnb and Airbnb.org have a very interesting approach where you've developed a global response tool to help peoples in situations of protracted displacement. So could you tell us a little bit about that response and how it evolved and how you all are currently engaged in some of the crises we're seeing today?
Yeah, I'd love to. And like Maria, agency is really important for us, and that co-creation with local entities is also important. We also sit further away. We are scattered around the globe, and so it's really important for us to be directly engaged with those folks who know best what's needed. And so we do have a really unique situation. So we have Airbnb.com, the home sharing platform that lots of you know and love, of course. And we have Airbnb.org, which is an independent nonprofit that was established by one of our founders. And so the goal for us is to connect individuals, communities to resources. And so we do that, and our main resource, of course, is access to the properties that folks have on Airbnb.com. And so what we do is we have 2 tracks. We have a partnership track where we work through grant funding, and we provide cash grants to organizations that are doing work. Typically, it's in the humanitarian relief section. We're working on refugee displacements, asylum seekers, forced or involuntary displacements, resettlements, et cetera. And then we have another side of the house, which is focused on disaster relief, where we're looking to provide short-term stays in properties that are listed on Airbnb for folks who have been displaced by disaster from their home. And so we operate in a couple of ways, but what's really unique is that Airbnb provides funding to us. It provides resources in terms of staffing, in terms of the ability to tap into the product, the supply, our host community, which is really the lifeblood of our organization across the enterprise, without hosts who are willing to offer their properties, sometimes even for free or at a discount to those in need. We'd have a much more challenging ability to reach or have an impact globally. As long as there's an Airbnb that's located in an area that is either receiving or accepting folks that are displaced, or there's an area where there has been a disaster or crisis that's impacted folks, we're able to try and get some folks housed. And then we work with the local entities, again, thinking through, that co-creation, what is it that they need? And sometimes it's a perfect alignment, and what is needed is that temporary short-term stay in one of our properties. We have a couple ways we can do that, again, through the grant funding, where organizations can book on behalf of those folks who are displaced. And then we offer vouchers where individuals themselves have that agency to select a property, make a reservation that's going to fit their needs of themselves and their families. And so that's really what we've done. What we did in Ukraine was a little different, where we sort of took one program from one side of the house and applied it to this use case. And we were able to be really successful. Our founders, again, made a commitment to house 100,000 folks that were displaced or fleeing Ukraine, and we were able to meet that goal earlier this year. And by working with the organizations who were already active in the conflict and housing people, they were able to refer to us folks who were fleeing, and we then in turn were able to issue them vouchers so they could book a stay. It works really well in a situation like that, because where people were going, they weren't damaged. The properties weren't damaged, they weren't destroyed. So there was a lot of supply, a lot of interest in our host community, again, the folks that are so important to us to be able to do this work. And so we were able to meet that goal. And so for us, we really recognize that we need that private sector support. We need that local engagement. We need our host community, and we need the ability to be as active as possible. And so it's just a really, really special situation for us to be in. There are also times when we realize, again, thinking through that our mission is about connecting to resources, where what's best needed is not a stay in an Airbnb. And so what we do is look to how can we turn to our other private sector friends. What do they have? What resources can we collectively combine in order to bring to bear? And a quick example is in Louisiana for Hurricane Ida, there was a state-recognized tribal group along the bayou that was not federally recognized. And so they had a much more difficult time to access federal funds. And they did not want to leave, and there were no Airbnb properties in the surrounding area. And so we worked with a private sector entity to get generators brought in to support them where they wanted to remain. And so they were able to have safe, habitable properties where they wanted to stay, and that's really, really important to us to always be mindful about what is that agency, what's best needed for them.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Chaland, one of the key discussions we've been having in the humanitarian sector for many years now is the need to engage non-traditional actors, and all of the panelists have already kind of touched on it, but I wanted to get your take. And by non-traditional actors, we don't just mean private sector, we also mean local responders, civil society organizations, local NGOs. And you have a lot of experience in this regard, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So would love to get your remarks about how this work has developed and what are some of the sort of the benefits of engaging local organizations in humanitarian response.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And it's always beautiful to go last because then I can hopefully add on to what has been said. Allow me to speak very much from my own very real lived experience, and sometimes that comes with passion, but allow me to just let it flow into this space because I think this is the best place to put it. Now, when I had the honor of listening to the earlier conversation, and I was listening to what the challenges are at the moment within the humanitarian sector, and really thinking through the biggest challenge right now being said to be about anticipation and timeliness of addressing some of these humanitarian issues. And I kept thinking about this young gentleman who goes around Kenya. He has a company. No, he just basically has a movement of that encompasses just himself. That he calls cup of uji. Uji is Kiswahili for porridge. And that's really all he can do. He's this one individual whose task is to identify which communities are struggling specifically around farming, because he himself grew up in an area where he, in times and with a background where he did not get food. And that's really what he can do, is every time there's an issue in Northeast Kenya, he will go there, you'll find him there. You'll hear there's flooding somewhere at the lakeside, you'll find him there with his, cup of ujis. Now, he's only able to help so many people, right? But does he anticipate? Absolutely, right? He's the kind of person who knows through our own local cultural knowledge, and whether or not you believe that we have rainmakers or not, we know whether rain is coming. We can look around and know, right now we know there's tensions within the region. We know which countries are feuding with who. DRC at the moment are preparing themselves potentially to fight against Rwanda. So what I'm saying is that the locals already anticipate, right? And they're timely. We've got this gentleman who goes there with whatever he can take, and then he makes a small appeal on his Facebook group, and people come together and are able to rally and give him what he could. Now, imagine if this gentleman was able to maybe move. He's a young man, so imagine if he could go to a youth group, or any other self-help group, a women's group, and go to them and say, folks, I have identified such and such, and I want to go there and I want to support them. Would you come along, or can you give me more resources, either materials or money, so that I can do some direct cash transfer? Imagine if you could do that easily. And imagine if this self-help group could then say, well, we have so much, but the need sounds like it's big. And what if I go to the community-based organization that's slightly bigger than me? And they can be able to go to the community-based organizations that already have those linkages with them and rally to, around this self-help group that then ultimately flows it down to this Kapovuji, and then it flows on to the communities that need it. Now, what I'm saying is that the challenge that we are saying about anticipation and timeliness, in my view, from where I'm seated, in this part of the world, is simply addressed by actually engaging those actors that we have often overlooked. Now, every time we hear about these fantastic commitments to localization or locally led development, we get very excited. We are always waiting. I have been waiting. I've been working in this capacity strengthening of local actors actively since the early 2000s. And we've been hearing about these commitments coming through, and we've been getting excited. Where I'm at in 2022, we acknowledge that it's not as simple as shifting, the direct grants that we saw all these amazing graphs about. It's not about shifting those grants from the very large multilaterals and INGOs directly to us. We understand that the cost of doing this in terms of administration and compliance and due diligence and so on and so forth would be significant for you. We also understand that from a bilateral point of view, after talking to them, over several years, they hold majority of the overseas development funds, and they're not able to. They can only give a handful of grants, major grants per country, and they're limited. They understand that they cannot directly invest in us. Now, what they have done traditionally, therefore, is gone on to work within this, in partnership. They've used these partnership models. The problem is that the partnership models are largely based in the global north, again. And these global north entities or intermediaries don't always, have tended then to monopolize the system. And they monopolize the system and are coming to work in these local communities without ceding power that we need to make decisions about where, when, and who needs the help in what time. They also do this without necessarily giving us all the money that we need. We are told how much money you need. And there's very little flexibility to switch. If this one area is not useful, we need to switch to this other area. But that flexibility is not always there. So what we have found is that many local actors, therefore, have decided, what, if that's what they're looking for, what are these big funders saying? They're saying they want us to have a holistic approach to community issues. They're saying we want a multidisciplinary approach to how we support these organizations. We want you to be able to scale. We want you to be able to absorb large amounts of money. As single entities, we are not able to do that. And so what has happened is organically you've seen that local different respondents, different types, shapes and sizes, the whole range that I just described, from individual movements to self-help groups, to community-based organizations, all the way to local and national organizations are now coming together. Can you who's already directly in the field, can you come together and join this coalition? And let's all then work together. I'm a little bit bigger. I have stronger financial systems. I can provide that. I've got stronger governance systems. I've got that. And if we come together why don't we then have joint actions? Let's coalesce around this one community that we have and see how we can best respond. Now, those models are there. Those models are there in terms of alternative intermediaries that are local, that are indigenous, that are very effective, and that have this very strong peer accountability mechanism that addresses some of those risks that a lot of funders often focus on when they're shying away from working directly with local actors. Now, the recent work that I'm doing at the moment, I'm in allyship with a US-based INGO called the Share Trust, just because there's no way I'm dealing with 5013C registrations and everything that requires in order for funding to flow here. And we are working collaboratively to build local coalition and accelerators. And we enter into a 3-year agreement with these coalitions, different shapes, sizes, but the idea is to have those different types of organizations or entities within this coalition and identify this community and say, okay, what is the challenge that we want to address? And then we address it directly. 80% of the funds that we raise goes directly to actions, to the coalition's work. 20% goes into the back end support, but most importantly, to do some of this advocacy work that we are saying, to show you the proof that actually working directly through local actors can work. And as I end that, I want to actually say a very big thank you to you, Maria. Last year, the coalition did a very rapid survey, like within, about 2 weeks within the community. One of the coalitions we have is in Uganda. And due to the effects of COVID, they said, well, what are the current problems? They did a very rapid survey through their community groups, community structures that they work through. They found out about the rise in cases of sexual abuse and gender violence. And we did a public appeal to raise some money to top up what they already had. And Humanities United came alongside us and gave us money, demonstrating to us what we say in my country, tenda mema, nenda zako, do good and go away. So I just to attest that when you speak about trust-based philanthropy, we had that honor of actually experiencing that, and it went a long way to supporting this particular coalition to bring the services rapidly to the communities that needed them. So that's just how I'll start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chaland, and great to hear the connection with humanity. Thank you for also pushing us to think about the possibilities if we are able to achieve localization, as well as some of the real obstacles. Now, going back to the question of finance, because I think it is one of the obstacles, and turning back to you, Andre, you kind of alluded to this untapped potential in the private sector, not just for philanthropic donations, but really long, deep engagement to help countries that are in situations of fragility move out of this fragility trap. And although there's been a lot of excitement about this deep engagement from the private sector, we haven't really seen that. So I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit what the obstacles are, what continues to be some of the things that disincentivize this engagement. And you reference some initiatives you're working on, like the Humanitarian Resilience Initiative. How is that helping us to sort of move towards greater engagement?
Great. Let me try and address it from both the perspective of kind of these bigger systemic challenges that we're seeing, excuse me, and then look at some of the specific stakeholder groups that we're trying to engage and bring together and share some examples as well. And I think when we started our work a couple of years ago with the launch of the initiative, of the HRI initiative, I think at the time, innovative finance was largely perceived as a way to sort of diversify the resource base, and I think it has matured over the years as that, yes, is one of the potential impacts as a way to partner with business. But I think more so it's also exposed a much wider discussion around this is not just about bringing the private sector into the humanitarian sector. And doing so too late, where really it's just a financing discussion, and it activates only one part of the business community, I would say. But it's also about the kind of the frank exchange needed about the kind of change that we need to see within the humanitarian various agencies and INGOs, donors as well as others, to work together. And I think what we haven't seen enough in the past was that these conversations and this dialogue happens early on. And apart from, I would say, the World Humanitarian Summit and maybe the Global Refugee Forum, there haven't been many spaces where that direct dialogue has happened in a way where there was that inclusion. And I say this again more from the business community side. Now, on the systemic challenges, when it comes to what we are trying to push for, which is to unlock more private capital going into these difficult environments, there's a big mismatch of the pipeline. I think we actually see quite an interesting ecosystem of what we call HRI opportunities. So these are companies that have entered more fragile contexts or operate in the fringes and try to enter, but face a number of different challenges, but also entrepreneurs, various startups, locally, regionally, as well as globally. But they're not yet quite meeting some of the key investor criteria to be able to reach scale. And where we see this in the most acute way is that there's actually been some really interesting movement and positive movement of donors supporting innovation through various kind of financing vehicles and channels. But very few of those are coming out with sort of a stronger business model where they're able to then reduce their dependence on the grants and really look at other sources of financing. The second one is really about organizations facing internal barriers. We don't discuss this enough, and one of my colleagues always speaks, it's the invisible work that needs to happen. And here we really speak about the improvement of your own readiness within an organization. It's about capacity, it's about incentives, it's about leadership support. I think the kind of leadership we saw from the ICRC as they've scaled their new financing models work was both bottom up, but it was definitely top down in terms of making sure that push of what was the role of a player like ICRC in working with the private sector was supported from the political side. And then the third one is, this is certainly not the first year we're having this discussion. It's been going on for quite some time. So we see actually parts of the ecosystem that is very active, but it's very fragmented. And what I mean by that is that there's sort of a coalescence of organizations and kind of various pools of funding that support specific stages of development, but there isn't enough alignment across, and there isn't sort of this extension of a line of sight of what's coming from, let's say, humanitarian sector that maybe a DFI or a private sector would be interested at a certain stage. And that's one of the areas we're really focused on and trying to support those opportunities, but also connect early on. Maybe just to highlight a couple of specific challenges and kind of the roles that we see as amongst various stakeholders. I would say that from the various companies and entrepreneurs that we're engaging with, this access to capital is a huge issue, and in part because even with a proven concept or a proven solution or product or service they're able to offer, and often they're still perceived as too small or even unstable in order to really attract larger scale private capital. But there's also a question of absorption capacity and the articulation of a clear ask to investors in where that type of financial support would be able to enable them to scale and to grow in different parts of their operations. I think DFIs play a critical role. Our opinion is that scale will not come and should not come with humanitarian dollars, but DFI funding combined with private sector is really the combination that we need to see more of in order to reach scale in these environments. But there's, I think, a lot of challenges there on internal incentives, also combined with and these are very active discussions on their ongoing difficulties to engage and invest in projects that deliver a lower return and are perceived as higher risk. I think investors are generally amongst those that are always most interested. We're not saying that it's easy to engage them, but they are most interested to understand how they can participate and how they can help. But what they're really missing is kind of that contextual understanding of these environments. And that's where humanitarians, play a key role, both locally and globally. But I don't want to forget to underline the importance of data. And that's what we've been hearing throughout our work. And that's not just financial, it's also data on the impact and the potential of that impact that such an investment can bring. And USAID is actually supporting some of this work to better understand the role of data in unlocking investments. Foundations are key but we're not seeing enough of this, I would say, to really take risk and provide seed catalytic capital for early ventures. We had the CEO of the IKEA Foundation speak in Davos, and his main message was they are the ones that are able to take the risk and potentially fail if necessary. But it is a way to stimulate new approaches and new partnerships. And I would say maybe finally on the donor side, what we're seeing is there is general appetite and openness, but this agenda is in constant, and when I say this agenda, I mean in partnering with other non-traditional actors, is in constant competition with the short-term needs and addressing the acute crisis. And I think the role of leadership, as well as both at the higher level, but also within organizations, to make sure that there is sustained space to look at some of these longer-term challenges, to collaborate with others, that is not diminished, even in the area where we see stronger crises erupt. Maybe one or two examples just to share, just to indicate of some of the movement that we're seeing that we take as positive signs. One is coming actually out of the WFP's Innovation Accelerator. It's a hydroponics project called H2Grow. They operate in 21 countries to essentially provide new skill sets to provide livelihoods to vulnerable communities by making them essentially hydroponics farmers. What they've been now doing, and where we worked with them, has been also about piloting a new business model in Kenya that's more of an asset-based loan model. And I think what's important here is that the way that's being tested and designed is that WFP doesn't necessarily have to play a role in the years to come of scaling this, but it provides a market entry point. It provides, I would say, the guardrails necessary to be able to build the foundation of a potential business opportunity that addresses the needs from the ground, but hands it over to a private operator potentially over time. And then the second one, I think we would like to see more of, but nonetheless, there are examples, for example, of DFIs supporting smaller ticket sizes. I think FMO is doing some very interesting work where, for example, they invested about 5 million euros in a microfinance institution in West Africa called Finel. And they were able to do that through their Massive fund that allows them to take greater risk and to invest early on. There are other examples, but maybe I'll pause here.
Sadie, I want to turn back to you. So Andre talked a bit about scale and some of the challenges with scaling approaches. And going back to the example that you shared about Airbnb.org, it seems like the success of that model really depends on your ability to tap into your corporation, but also work with hosts. And I'm wondering, what are some of the constraints to this approach? Particularly, we see a growing number of people in need of housing because of displacement. And to what extent can this also be applied in more fragile contexts? I think you alluded to this is where partnerships come into play. So I'd love to hear a bit more about these constraints and how you go about establishing partnerships that could help you kind of address the growing needs of people that are displaced.
Yeah, I think I heard a little bit about trust and certainly about donor and donor intent. And that is something, so we, again, are in a unique position where we're a nonprofit. We also rely on donors, and donors have their intent. We're also a funder. So we're providing funding to organizations. And so there is sort of an inherent tension between how do we make sure we're getting those funds or our resources in terms of access to short-term stays that are billed to Airbnb.org to the right communities, the communities that are in need. And then how do we also incorporate our own diversity, equity, and inclusion goals to prioritize the most underserved communities in a disaster. And so there is, some inherent challenges in that. And I think it starts with recognizing that exists, and then being very clear about what our mission and our focus is, and making sure that we're looking for organizations who have the trust of the local communities. Those, sometimes it's a faith-based organization. Sometimes it's it's the guy, right, who's known in that neighborhood, who knows the people who live there, who knows who are impacted. Sometimes we struggle with people even understanding what Airbnb is. What do you mean you're going to put me in somebody's house? Can I see it first? What's the address? That can be a very real barrier and limitation. And so, at the time of an event, we're constantly trying to address all of the things at once, and it's definitely a challenge. And I think that's why it's so important for us to have that alignment between our corporate side, our nonprofit side, our nonprofit and community-based organizations, those local folks who understand what's going on and what the needs are, and then that trust that they can be candid with us about what they need and what they don't need. It's not easy to be in a position to say, hey, thanks, I really appreciate that offer of a short-term stay, but that's not what my community needs. And so we really want to create those relationships like everyone else, pre-event. It's hard when, to your point, there's constantly something going on. There is always a need. And so we just try to do what it is that we can. We try to be very clear about what it is that we can offer, And we try to make sure that we're always talking about the impact so that our host community and our donors understand what we're able to accomplish and encourage them to certainly support that more. And then we're looking to how do we get to those other areas where there are some limitations, where there might be less properties or less hosts. You know, what is it that we can offer? And so that comes into play when we think about what is our access to other resources that might be needed. And for us, you know, we're a relatively small team, and so there's always a challenge with trying to get in touch with and reach and connect and build relationships with the right people at the right times. And it's just a matter of continuing to be clear about this is where we want to go. And we're going to be very laser focused about getting there. And we have the benefit, this is one of the things that's great about working with a tech organization, is that innovation is sort of the bedrock and foundation. And, you know, man, they'll be on it. They are really supportive and allowing us to be as aggressive as possible to making sure that we're providing the right kind of aid. And we have to be mindful of that balance of being respectful and considering the agency for what the community wants. It can't just be that we come in from on high and be like, here, we have this. That doesn't work, right? It's got to be like, we're here, what can we do? How can we partner with you? What can we, you know, how can we assist? And how do we not get in their way when they're also responding? They're also delivering their own aid. They're also going through the process of vetting and issuing the relief that they offer. And so it's challenging and it can be done, but it starts with, and at least for us, because we're founder-led and our founders believe in this community and creating community on a global scale and leveraging the resources, it starts with having that backing, and it's an important part of the foundation of our organization. So it allows us on the org side to have the freedom to get out there and hit it.
Thank you. We are running a little low on time, but I do want to get in a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. So Chilan, turning back to you, in your opinion, what does it take to create equitable partnerships between local stakeholders and external stakeholders, whether it's the private sector, institutional donors, you can think of others? What does equity look like when you have these inherent differentials in power? And can you give us advice for those of us who are coming in as external actors as to how to really intentionally build partnerships that are equitable? Chilan, you're on mute. Chilan, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Oh my goodness, I had gone on and on. Sorry. Yeah, I think it sounds like a very simple idea, but it actually has got lots of nuances to it. In my experience, building this equitable partnership goes beyond that direct relationship that you're having with the organization and acknowledging everything that comes with the entities or the parties involved. It requires us to acknowledge all the history of where we've come from and to where we are at the moment. And then we build this relationship that is, for me, three critical things. Is that it recognizes the power, the inherent and very overt powers that both entities have got, because we keep talking about shifting power like we want to make one party powerless, but really that doesn't work. We need to bring both our powers together and make this huge bomb that for the greater good. And so what I'm saying is that we need to come up and relate in ways that allow each one of us to first and foremost recognize that no one is better than the other. No one's idea is better than the other. You may have resources, but I have resources in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the local networks, in terms of everything that is going to make you more effective and efficient in doing what it is you've set out to do. So we need to be able to actually make sure that all parties are involved in three critical things. One, in crafting the vision. Now, the idea of consortiums in the past, putting together a proposal and coming back and then rallying us together and saying, you know, organization X, Y, and Z, you will do this, that, and the other, that does not constitute a shared vision. And then making us believe in your vision, does not constitute that. So the co-creation approaches that I'm seeing now is a step in the right direction. The second piece is that therefore we need also that collaboration when it comes to designing the programs. What needs to happen where how long is it going to take, who are the key actors. So that whole idea around making decisions together needs to happen for it to be actually equitable, because that's another area where we feel powerless. And the third most critical thing that always breaks the back is money, right? It's always money that comes with everything else, right? So we need to have equal say in how this money is distributed. How much money are we getting? Do we have visibility of how much money is in our kitty? How are we distributing it? Are we at the table? Are we having those conversations that will help us unpack all of that? Now, if those three critical elements are there, then we can move forward. Now, this is not to say that the problem is only with those that are coming in with planes or boats. It's not only about the foreigners. We also have our own issues with as local actors that come to play, because we are coming from a history where there's a whole spectrum of how we collaborate. We've come from a highly individualistic, low trust zone where we were in high competition with one another, or we just settled down to coexist with one another because we just have to. And then we moved into this highly competitive mindset where we now said, okay, I want to know what so-and-so is doing, or I want to learn. So we started exchanging information, cooperating and coordinating with one another to protect our turfs or to learn from one another. And we're now moving more and more into realizing that we now need to take advantage of each other's proximities to powers, to money, to communities. And so we are seeing more collaborations and integrations happening. Now, those who are coming from the outside, you need to take time to learn and understand who are these people that you want to engage in partnership with. What I'll say is that for the large donors who have a lot of power, you have a critical role in helping us to build some of these partnerships. I think continue to reform your funding systems, because they have played a role in creating this dynamic that I've just described, but also invest in key structures and systems outside of the organization. It's okay to build the capacity of the institution, but if you don't play a part in helping the ecosystem, they move out of the institution and go and start to deal with unhelpful local community government structures, or have to struggle with some of the local private sector actors that are also in the same space. So do what you can to also invest in that, and absolutely fund collaboratives that you have seen are actually doing a fantastic job. And as you're doing all of that in all these amazing spaces where you're at, where you're trying to shift your systems, where you're trying to actually figure out how you shift power, pull us up into the table, call us to the table. We know, we have ideas, we have thoughts, we've experienced all of this. If you're in tables where you're making these critical decisions, as much as possible, create allyship with folks as much as possible in the Global South. If you're on a table and you see we are not represented, pull up a chair and call us. We are always more than willing to help input into helping to, because this is not just our problem or just your problem, it's our problem. So that's what I would say in terms of how we move forward to build that equitable partnership.
Thank you so much, Chaland. And then last question to you, Maria. It seems like to achieve what Chaland is talking about, we really have to fundamentally change the way we deliver aid. And so you mentioned earlier this concept of accompaniment, and I thought maybe you could just, in closing, before we open it up for questions, could tell us a bit what exactly this is and how this diverges with the status quo of how we deliver aid.
Thank you. Actually, my sister has very much explained what accompaniment really means. Is this is our problem, not you sitting here in DC, come up with the solution, the funding, and then you go into a country and tell them, okay, this is what we want you to do, and this is how you want to do. So accompaniment, I will say, is really a shift from the traditional way of how we as funders, as we within philanthropy are engaging in these areas. It's more about walking alongside each other. When my sister was talking about uji, I felt homesick. I want porridge. So it's here you call it grits. So I was actually very, I want some porridge. And also made me think about our partners who we support in South Sudan, who have a program around taking tea together and using taking tea together to be able to identify the issues that are affecting them and coming up with solutions. And also accompaniment is, let me not even make it, it's not a buzzword. Let me tell you what it really, really is. It's more is, we recognize the power that we come in, and she has nicely said that power that we have, how do we use the power to be able to advance the needs of our partners on the ground? Like for us at Humanitarian, we are very close to US government. So we do a lot of advocacy to ensure that our partners' issues are being integrated in their planning, ensuring that our partners are getting the necessary resources and funding. And also accompaniment is, it's okay for you, for the partner to tell you, hey, step back. If you come alongside me, you bring trouble. You bring, in Nigeria, they say, wahala, you're just troublemaker. Just stay back and just give us the funding and trust us to be able to do this work. That's also accompaniment. Are you stepping back? What role is it that you're playing? And it's also not stuck in stone. It's a continuous living tool that we keep on changing and adapting and ensuring that we are able to respond appropriately and when necessary. And one thing which is very, very clear is COVID-19 showed us that we're actually flexible. You know, I remember when they told us, you guys are going to work from home, the first thing we all did within the organization, reached out to our partners. How are you all doing? What resources are needed? What changes need to be done? And we quickly, which was surprising because normally to shift from a project to a general operating, there's so many processes. But let me tell you, the way it was done so quick showed us that it's actually possible. And we were able to, some of the issues they had was it was very difficult to transition from being in space to online. What resources is it that we need to provide for them? So it's really like playing a lot of active listening, active conversation, and deep relationship, and having more long-term connection and partnership with these partners so as you can be able to co-create. Lastly, I'll just say it's really a shift of how we show up and more bringing the people. Because a lot of times when you sit here, it's pepper, budget, this, but our company is a reminder of the Ubuntu, which is who we are as people when we engage in these humanitarian situations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an excellent way of describing it, and thank you for showing that it's a lot of sort of listening and being nimble to the situation. So we don't have much time, but we do have about 10 minutes for questions either from the audience here or online. There is a microphone that you have in the audience if you'd like to pose a question, and I will be checking to see if there's been anything online.
Hi, my name's Alexa Schmidt. I'm from Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard University, and thank you for your time today. And what we do as part of our Children in Crisis program is we work with local partners to implement locally driven solutions, as well as to do the monitoring and evaluation to highlight the impact of that really profound programming. And one thing that we do as an academic partner, as I said, is to amplify and elucidate the impact of the work. Because so often, as Juliet mentioned earlier, it's number of patients in clinic versus the impact of the health outcomes. What role do you see at academic partners to do that accompaniment, as you mentioned, to really amplify the work that's being done?
Yes, anyone who would like to respond from the panel. Actually, let's take 2 questions at a time. Yep.
Hi, thank you. Alice Obrecht from ALNAP. I had a question for the colleagues who are working on the ground with partners. We saw, you mentioned the importance of accompaniment and the opportunities for that you saw in COVID-19. I was wondering how much you've been seeing communities themselves really picking up those leadership roles. We saw a lot of communities actually going in and delivering aid projects or facilitating that themselves in COVID-19, particularly in camp settings. I was wondering how much of that you've seen and if that's going to stick around. And then just on the private sector, to Andre's points, we see this a lot in our research as well, that this kind of call for more private sector engagement really hasn't materialized. And I was wondering more around the incentives for that, and if the fact that we have, and I'm of course biased on this because I'm a researcher, but the fact that we have real struggles with getting good, solid impact data is a deterrent to that for private sector partners. I think it was interesting to see the ICRC experimenting with impact bonds and really struggling actually to get the kinds of data on outcomes that private sector investors are used to seeing in their sector. So how much of that is a barrier to getting more private sector funding and engagement? Thank you.
you want to respond, Maria?
Yes, the one with how do you engage academia within accompaniment. I'll look at academia, who are the local universities you're working with on the ground, and how are you co-creating with these universities. I think a lot of times academia, it's like the Western academia who do this kind of research and ignore academia on the ground. I come from a great university called Makerere University based in Kampala, and I'm like, those are the partners academia should be engaging, these local universities who actually have closer connection to the communities. So that's one area. And then the other is, I'll give an example. The past year, we worked very closely with co-creators, we call local peace builders from across the globe, I think 25 countries. And they were really, really fascinated that we were giving them the space to identify the solutions, to identify what to do. We gave them the resources and said, okay, what are the needs? What is it that needs to be done? So I think with funders moving towards that direction, people are coming up, and you've very nicely had my sister from Kenya talk about how we're showing up and engaging and taking up leadership on this. Because even when all the INGOs left, all the humanitarian agencies leave, it's the local actors who take up these issues and take up how to respond and use the networks, the culture, to be able to respond to a lot of this situation. So we have to give them the space. It's okay, step back, trust them to be able to do it.
Maybe I just add to that, actually, sorry. I was going to say at Mercy Corps, the organization I work for, we also engage a lot with academic institutions through partnerships for doing impact evaluations, randomized controlled trials, things of that nature, and we've really seen the utility and the fruits of this type of investment and evidence, because it's really important for the donor community, for local communities. Everybody wants to know what is the actual impact of the work we're doing. Are the investments actually achieving their goals? So just wanted to make that plug for Mercy Corps as well.
Yeah, I think you'd mentioned whether or not we expect to see that sort of groundswell communities being there for each other to continue, and I would say yes. You know, one of the really cool things that happened in the Ukraine response were that people started to book properties listed on Airbnb with no intent of staying there, just specifically to get funding directly to folks who were in Ukraine. And so, you know, our host community is amazing and creative and spontaneous. And so, you know, to your point, you know, do good and get out of the way. That's what we did there, right? We let them lead that, and we still tried to supplement with the very specific strategic housing of folks working through organizations who are also able to provide wraparound services to those displaced. But I think it's part of our job to get out of the way when it's necessary. And I think relating to academia, I think that's one of the things that everybody struggles with is trying to get that impact across beyond the numbers, right, that they're always looking at. And I think for us, it starts with trying to recognize that we need to define impact differently. We need to be the leaders in sort of letting people know that it's not just about those numbers. Mm-hmm. It is about the stories of the communities that are brought along and the individual households that are brought along, and that work that we're doing so that when we're very targeted about reaching organizations, particularly community-based organizations who don't historically get funding that we see that goes to the larger NGOs, and why that makes a difference. And so we're a young organization. It's going to take some time for us to be able to build that history, that length of time to show the impact over time. But it starts at least, you know, trying to get people to understand it is more about the numbers. And we hope that we can be successful in that.
Thank you, Sadie. Andre, do you want to respond to the second question?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about the ICRC's humanitarian impact bond. My understanding has always been that the reason why they chose that model for their physical rehabilitation work was because of ICRC's work over the years, if not decades, and the data that they had to essentially reinforce about the potential of the impact for bringing in both donors and investors to support that. But for sure, it remains a big issue. And when I say that, I think there's kind of two components to it. One is the broader accessibility of kind of market data and the understanding of, let's say, if we take teams within the humanitarian sector that are looking to deploy new innovative financing models, to leverage that data as a way to project of the potential of a market, right? It's not just the potential of the impact of a project or a specific community, but after that, what's the growth potential? And it's a little bit about how best to leverage that. And I think so far in terms of the sectors where that's been most prevalent and kind of where there's been multiple areas of effort has been in the energy side, especially in terms of starting to green humanitarian operations, but then there's a much broader discussion about energy access, both to displaced and host communities. I think the second one is a lack of understanding and dialogue on what type of data investors would need in order to make an informed decision about that being an investable opportunity. And that's part of that work that I briefly mentioned that USAID is supporting, that Dalberg, IRC, and Cross Boundary are currently leading on, which is essentially stress testing the types of data that would be necessary for an investor to be either reassured or to better understand about the potential. So I would say there's a discussion around broader potential of new markets, but then there's also the gathering and the use of different types of data that speaks to different types of investors, depending on what they need. And maybe finally, just to say that there's some interesting work also being done in that respect by the Refugee Investment Network and Acumen in East Africa.
Thank you so much. I know there's one last question, but unfortunately we're out of time, so I would encourage you to find panelists if you would like to pose a question to them after this, which is going to be our lunch break. Could you please join me in a round of applause for the panelists? So this was a really great discussion, and I hope everybody will join for the afternoon sessions where we will have the ability to dig more deeply in more region-specific panels. Very importantly, I want to give you some guidance on how we will be having lunch. So we'll be serving lunch in the reception area. And then after lunch, our first set of breakout panels will begin promptly at 12:30. The Aiding Afghanistan Under Taliban Control panel, which is moderated by Catherine Bliss, will be in room 2C. And please note that the capacity for this room is 35 people, and seats will be taken on a first-come, first-served basis. The second panel, Humanitarian Assistance Amidst Great Power Competition in Syria, moderated by Dr. John Alterman, will take place in room 2AB. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.